Welcome back, I'm Tucker. For the ultra-wealthy, high prices guarantee perfection. But today, the most expensive item on the menu is also their last. From a man who bought a luxury bird's nest through an illegal supplier, to a businessman who celebrated New Year's over a luxury seafood dinner, only for a lobster sauce to expose the problem in the worst possible way. It was October 19, 2019, in a gated waterfront property outside Miami, Florida. Inside a modern mansion overlooking the bay, Joshua Monroe Jr. was preparing a private dinner built around a dish that very few people in the United States had ever tasted. Joshua was 35 years old and made his money through a network of questionable investments, shell companies, and business ventures that rarely survived close scrutiny. He enjoyed expensive things, but more than that, he enjoyed owning things other people could not get. Rare watches, rare liquor, rare cars. If something was difficult to obtain, Joshua wanted it. A few weeks earlier, his business partner, Robin Thomas, 30 years old, had told him about edible bird's nest soup, a luxury dish made from the nests of swiftlets and often sold for thousands of dollars per pound. Robin described it as a delicacy consumed by wealthy collectors and business elites throughout parts of Asia. Reading this, I can tell that Robin was certain that Joshua would be interested enough to try his suggestion. Robin happened to know someone who could source bird's nests outside normal import channels. Through that contact, the two were introduced to an unofficial supplier who claimed to have access to wild cave-harvested nests collected from remote limestone caves. Joshua immediately preferred the idea over commercially available products. To him, the appeal was not just the dish itself, but the fact that it came from a source most people could never access. Within days, he purchased several nests through the supplier. He invited Robin to his house for a private tasting, eager to show off what he believed was a far more authentic product than anything available through legal distributors. Then, on the day of the dinner, Robin canceled. A scheduling conflict came up at the last minute, and he told Joshua he would have to reschedule. Joshua decided to continue without him. That evening, Joshua prepared the bird's nest soup himself using instructions he had found online. His usual house staff had been given the night off because the dinner was intended to be a private meeting between him and Robin. With Robin canceling only a few hours beforehand, Joshua saw no reason to call everyone back in. The nests looked unusual, darker and rougher than the photographs he had seen from commercial suppliers, but he took that as proof of authenticity rather than a warning sign. And that must be the first sign that he overlooked. He should have questioned it, but he didn't. He ate alone. Within several hours, Joshua developed a severe headache, dizziness, and unusual fatigue. He initially dismissed the symptoms as dehydration or exhaustion. As the night progressed, his condition worsened. His breathing became increasingly difficult despite no obvious obstruction, and he began experiencing confusion and weakness. By the early hours of the morning, he was struggling to remain conscious. No emergency call was made. Joshua was found the following afternoon after employees became concerned when repeated calls went unanswered. Responding authorities discovered him deceased inside the residence. The medical examination identified fatal methemoglobinemia caused by severe nitrite poisoning. Investigators initially believed the contamination had originated from the birds' nests themselves and treated the case as a food safety incident, as improperly processed cave-harvested nests can naturally contain elevated nitrite levels. The case initially appeared to be a fatal food poisoning incident. That changed when detectives traced the purchase back to the supplier introduced through Robin Thomas. Financial records revealed that Robin owed Joshua a substantial amount of money through failed business ventures and private loans. Investigators later uncovered communications showing that Robin had deliberately contaminated the birds' nests with concentrated sodium nitrite before delivering them to Joshua. Laboratory testing confirmed nitrite concentrations far beyond what could occur naturally. Robin was later convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The investigation also exposed several illegal financial activities connected to both men. Multiple businesses were shut down, assets were seized, and additional criminal charges were filed against several associates tied to their operations. Joshua died alone, poisoned by his friend, but our next case died surrounded by people caused by her own impatience. It was on the 14th of September, 2015, at a private vineyard estate in Napa Valley, California, where an invitation-only networking dinner brought together investors, developers, and senior executives from across the state. Sandra Forbes was 42 years old, a successful commercial real estate developer based in Sacramento. Over the previous decade, she had built a reputation turning overlooked properties into profitable developments and was always looking for the next opportunity to expand. The dinner was not open to the public. Attendance was limited to a select group of investors, developers, and executives, and the menu featured imported luxury ingredients, including a limited allocation of authentic Japanese Wagyu beef. Sandra had received an invitation and brought her longtime friend Melissa Drew as her guest. Melissa often joked that Sandra treated networking like a second full-time job. Even before dinner began, Sandra was already moving through the crowd, introducing herself to potential contacts and looking for opportunities. I find that detail telling rather than critical. Sandra had built a career by not wasting opportunities, and a room full of investors was not a place she was going to treat as purely social. During the early courses, Sandra noticed an investment executive across the terrace whose firm had financed projects similar to her own. A conversation with him could potentially open doors worth millions. As the evening continued, she eventually found an opportunity to introduce herself, and the two spent several minutes discussing current development projects and investment trends. When the Wagyu beef course was served, the conversation shifted briefly to the meal. The beef had been imported from Japan in limited quantities specifically for the event and was accompanied by a small serving of premium caviar. Sandra seemed genuinely excited by it. Melissa later recalled Sandra mentioning that authentic Wagyu was still relatively rare in the United States, and explaining some of the details she had learned about its grading and production. The executive appeared interested, and Sandra continued talking while preparing another bite. Wanting to sample both together, she stacked several slices of Wagyu and added a spoonful of caviar on top. The mouthful was noticeably larger than the portions she had been taking earlier. I think this is the point where two different priorities collided. Sandra wanted to enjoy one of the most expensive dishes on the menu, but she also wanted to keep the attention of someone who might become an important business connection. As she continued describing the beef, she attempted to respond to a question before fully swallowing the bite. The interruption triggered an immediate cough. She paused, trying to recover discreetly, but the coughing persisted and quickly became more forceful. Within moments, it became clear she was struggling to clear her airway. Nearby guests initially assumed it was a temporary irritation, but her condition escalated rapidly. Melissa and others moved closer as Sandra attempted to breathe and could no longer form coherent speech. A guest with basic emergency training intervened, attempting abdominal thrusts, while another called emergency services. Estate staff arrived and assisted in continued efforts to clear the obstruction. The efforts produced no sustained improvement. Sandra lost consciousness, and emergency personnel continued resuscitation attempts during transport to the hospital, but she never regained a pulse. Sandra Mason Forbes was pronounced dead later that evening. The official cause of death was accidental airway obstruction resulting in hypoxic cardiac arrest, caused by a severe choking event during the meal. Melissa later provided statements to investigators, while the investment executive confirmed they had been speaking moments before the emergency began. The death was ruled accidental, and the vineyard reviewed its emergency response procedures following the incident. Sandra died at a dinner table she had chosen for professional reasons, but our next focus, a banking executive, asked a certified chef to bend a protocol that existed for exactly his safety. It was on the 23rd of June, 2017 in Tokyo, Japan. In a luxury penthouse suite in a high-rise serviced apartment building, a corporate dinner was held, and nobody suspected any problems. Lars Matthew Eriksson was 54 years old, a Norwegian banking executive who had lived in Japan long enough to understand its culture, its customs, and its corporate rituals. And on this particular evening, he sat among senior partners at a celebratory dinner, marking the completion of a major regional banking acquisition, a meal prepared in the kaiseki tradition, with licensed fugu as its centerpiece. The chef working that evening was certified and experienced, and his protocol was sound. Organs removed first and isolated, tools segregated, edible muscle sliced and plated only after the separation was complete. But the dinner was running behind schedule, and Lars was more focused on timing. The presentation had concluded successfully, and he wanted the dinner to proceed without delay. As guests settled, he requested that his portion of fugu be served first. The chef explained that preparation of fugu required a strict sequence of steps and complete separation between the tools used to handle toxic organs and the tools used to slice edible flesh. Because in fugu preparation, sequencing is not a preference, it is the entire safety system, Lars insisted, pressuring the chef to have his own portion immediately. The chef agreed, reluctantly, and a junior assistant was assigned to prepare a separate early serving for Lars before the remaining platters were assembled for the rest of the guests. In that compressed window, a slicing knife still active in the workflow, one that had passed near the liver-adjacent abdominal cavity during organ removal, was used to cut the final edible slices before the sterilization cycle was complete. Microscopic tetrodotoxin residue transferred from the blade to Lars's portion without any visible sign of contamination. The remaining servings were prepared later using properly sanitized equipment. The chef knew the protocol existed for a reason. He agreed to the request anyway, under the kind of social and professional pressure that is very difficult to refuse at a table full of senior banking executives. I do not think Lars understood what he was asking for when he asked for his plate first. Lars ate his portion, and the evening continued. 25 minutes later, he felt a tingling sensation around his mouth, mild at first, then spreading to his fingers. Within the hour, his muscles had weakened, his speech had slurred, and he could no longer stand. By the time emergency services arrived, the paralysis had reached his respiratory system. Despite ventilation and intensive medical intervention, Lars Matthew Eriksson died later that same night. Investigators determined that the contamination was limited entirely to the separately prepared portions served to Lars. The remaining executives who attended the dinner reported no symptoms and required no medical treatment. The toxic exposure was traced to a single knife reused before the sterilization cycle had been completed. Authorities concluded that the restaurant had used properly sourced fugu and employed a certified chef, but that a deviation from the normal preparation sequence had allowed contamination to occur. Fugu's service was suspended during the investigation, and the chef was formally questioned before authorities determined there was no evidence of intentional misconduct. Investigators ultimately concluded that a single deviation from the established preparation sequence had allowed the contamination to reach Lars's plate. And when I think about it, if Lars hadn't pushed the chef for an early serving and the chef hadn't agreed, nobody would have died that night. Lars died because a protocol built around strict sequencing was asked to bend once. The next story also takes place at a celebratory dinner, except this time the danger was invisible, hidden inside a dish that had been quietly modified. It was the 12th of April, 2014. In downtown Chicago, one of the city's most celebrated experimental restaurants in the upscale dining district was deep into its Saturday service, and a couple had left their home in Hinsdale for what was meant to be a rare night of celebration. William Lively was 38 years old, a self-made industrialist who owned a steel manufacturing company, a Midwestern structural steel supplier that had grown from a small fabrication shop into a major regional contractor. Success had brought wealth, but not time. His days were defined by production schedules, supply chain pressure, and expansion demands that rarely paused. For more than a decade, life had narrowed into work and recovery between work. Meals with Laura were often interrupted, conversations shortened by fatigue, and weekends frequently absorbed by emergencies at the plant. Their 10th wedding anniversary was an intentional break from that rhythm. William had cleared his schedule entirely and chosen a downtown Chicago restaurant known for modern, experimental fine dining. It was a place they had long intended to visit, but never prioritized. William had lived with a peanut allergy since childhood. It had been severe in his youth, but managed in adulthood through avoidance and caution. Before the dinner, he had reviewed the restaurant's menu and saw nothing that appeared to contain peanuts. He felt sure the food was safe, so he never mentioned his allergy to anyone, and no one at the restaurant thought to ask. For his main course, he ordered a slow-cooked beef dish with seasonal vegetables and a savory foam. Unknown to him, the kitchen had recently modified the foam using a peanut-derived stabilizing ingredient that had not yet been updated in service documentation or communicated clearly to front-of-house staff. The evening continued normally until minutes after eating. William initially felt only mild discomfort, then tightness in his throat. a discomfort that moved quickly and without mercy into something far worse. His airway narrowing, his breathing becoming labored, and Laura called for staff immediately. Paramedics administered epinephrine and initiated oxygen support, and transported him to hospital with urgency, where the medical team administered further doses and initiated full resuscitation protocols. But William had entered severe anaphylactic shock with rapid systemic collapse. He was pronounced dead later that night. The incident was classified as fatal anaphylaxis due to peanut exposure. A formal investigation identified a breakdown in internal coordination regarding the modified ingredient and insufficient verification of allergen risks. The Harper family filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit alleging negligence in allergen control and failure to disclose a high-risk ingredient. The restaurant denied recklessness, framing the incident as a systems failure rather than deliberate misconduct. Settlement discussions emerged before trial. I think about Laura, sitting across that table on their 10th anniversary, watching a systems failure take her husband, and I find I cannot make that framing feel adequate. Following the case, the restaurant implemented stricter allergen verification protocols, requiring formal checks for all modified dishes across both kitchen and service teams. For Laura, someone was blamed, but nothing truly felt settled. The anniversary that was supposed to be a celebration became the moment her world fell apart. William died because a modified ingredient and an unmentioned allergy produced a gap that neither side of the table could see. But somewhere else, a generous man spent an entire day in open heat supervising his estate's Eid celebrations before sitting down to a heavy meal, but could not finish it. It was on the 15th of June, 2018, Konya, Turkey. The city woke into Eid al-Fitr under a dry, lingering heat. Meanwhile, a wealthy estate owner had thrown open his gates to share the occasion with hundreds of people. Kemal Arslan was a 68-year-old wealthy Turkish oil businessman, known for philanthropy and firm control in business circles, and the kind of man who believed that if something needed to be done properly, he needed to be there to see it done. He was a wealthy estate owner with a reputation for generosity, and every Eid he organized one of the largest charitable distributions in his circle, rams slaughtered and prepared on the grounds, meat and bread and rice handed out to families from the outer courtyard, while his private guests were received inside the residence for a formal dinner. It was a large operation, and Kemal was at the center of all of it. He had been outside since the morning, moving between the slaughter area and the distribution points, supervising staff, checking logistics, standing under an open sky in persistent dry heat. By the time the evening meal arrived, he had spent hours in the sun, and his body had been quietly accumulating strain that nobody around him could see. Staff had suggested he rest, but he had not. I can understand him. A man who built something large enough to require that kind of operation rarely built it by stopping when people suggested he slow down. The inner dining hall was cooler, dimly lit, and tightly controlled. A private Eid dinner had been prepared for close associates, featuring premium lamb ribs slow-roasted for hours, whole cuts of imported beef, saffron-infused rice, rich reductions, and elaborate traditional dishes prepared by private chefs throughout the day. Traditional drinks, strong Turkish tea, and sweet sherbet circulated continuously between courses. The shift from fasting to feasting was abrupt, but culturally familiar in that setting. Roughly an hour into the meal, subtle changes began. He mentioned a faint tightness in his chest, but dismissed it as fatigue. Soon after came discomfort in the upper abdomen, mild nausea, and shortness of breath that he tried to regulate silently. Guests noticed his color shifting, paler than before, small beads of sweat forming despite the cooled room. His speech slowed. He paused mid-sentence more often. He adjusted posture repeatedly, as though trying to settle something internal that would not settle. Then the pattern broke. Kemal complained of a sudden heavy pressure in the center of his chest that spread into his left arm and up toward his jaw, accompanied by sharp difficulty breathing and a wave of dizziness that left him gripping the table. He attempted to stand but collapsed beside the head of the table. Guests recognized immediately that something was critically wrong. The response was immediate but disordered. CPR began at once. Emergency services arrived quickly and initiated advanced cardiac life support. Defibrillation was attempted during transport. He remained in ventricular fibrillation throughout. Kemal Arslan was pronounced dead before reaching hospital. Medical findings identified acute myocardial infarction, complicated by ventricular fibrillation as the cause of death, set against a background of pre-existing coronary artery disease whose severity had not been formally assessed. Investigators noted that no single factor alone had triggered the event. Rather, a combination of prolonged heat exposure, cumulative dehydration, physical exertion, and a sudden heavy celebratory meal had pushed a stable underlying condition past the point of recovery. The window for intervention had been narrow from the start. Kemal's heart had been carrying an unmeasured condition through everything that day asked of it. We move on to northern Italy, where a man fell in love with raw oysters at a corporate dinner and ordered them for a Sunday lunch over a supplier's objection. It was the 21st of May, 2017 in northern Italy. A soft, warm Sunday afternoon settled over a lakeside villa near Lake Como, the air mildly humid after a week of early summer heat. A private family lunch was being prepared, marking an otherwise uneventful weekend. Marco Bellini, 61 years old, was the founder of a major packaging machinery company in Turin. He lived with type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease, both medically managed but still relevant risk factors for severe infection. Several months earlier, Marco had attended a private corporate meeting hosted by a foreign client. The event included a curated seafood course where he encountered raw oysters for the first time. He was unexpectedly impressed by the texture and flavor, describing them afterward as clean and refined. Unlike other guests, Marco became particularly fixated on the dish. Before leaving the event, he specifically requested the host for the contact details of the specialty seafood supplier responsible for the oysters. Within weeks, he began ordering premium oysters for personal use, reserving them for special occasions at home. That weekend, Marco arranged a seafood Sunday brunch at his residence following a successful week of merger negotiations. Wanting to recreate the experience from the private meeting, he contacted the same supplier and requested a midday delivery of raw oysters. The supplier warned that delivering over the weekend and keeping the food cold would be hard, but Marco pushed ahead and demanded the order arrive by Sunday midday. The oysters came from a licensed coastal farm and were transported inland through a refrigerated route, but a documented temperature handling delay occurred during the final distribution stage. The oysters arrived shortly before noon. Marco enthusiastically presented the oysters as the centerpiece of the meal, describing them as a delicacy. His wife was unconvinced. Their teenage son and daughter disliked the idea of eating uncooked shellfish and requested alternative dishes from the kitchen instead. Marco laughed at their reluctance and consumed the oysters himself. His wife was unconvinced. His children refused. Marco laughed and ate them alone. I really wish he knew that it was their instincts saving them. By mid-afternoon, Marco developed abdominal discomfort, nausea, and unusual fatigue. He initially attributed it to dietary indulgence and stress. Within a few hours, symptoms intensified rapidly: watery diarrhea, fever, and escalating weakness. By early evening, he was getting much worse. He had a fever. His mind was foggy, and he could barely stand without losing his balance. Emergency medical services were called. Paramedics found Marco with dangerously low blood pressure, a racing heart, and signs of severe infection. He was rushed to hospital in critical condition. Tests confirmed Vibrio vulnificus, a bacterium found in raw shellfish. In healthy people, it causes little harm, but in those with diabetes or liver disease, it can be deadly. Marco had no chance. Within hours, his body went into septic shock. His organs failed one by one. He was gone less than 15 hours after that noon delivery. Investigators traced the oysters to a broken cold chain during rushed weekend transport. No charges were filed. Marco left behind a wife and 2 children. Marco insisted on the delivery over the supplier's objection, and the cold chain failed exactly where the warning said it might. The next story moves to Rio de Janeiro on New Year's Day, where a man attended a private dinner, but holiday crowds on Copacabana Beach delayed the response that might have saved him. It was the 1st of January, 2013 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The streets glittered on the night with fireworks cracking above Copacabana Beach, and somewhere high above the crowd, inside a penthouse with a perfect view of it all, a dinner party was about to become something else entirely. Eduardo Vasconcelos, 58 years old, a senior industrial figure with long-standing interests tied to Brazil's extractive and export logistics sectors. Ricardo Almeida, 62 years old, was hosting a New Year's Day celebration in his home. He was Eduardo's long-term associate involved in freight coordination and bulk mineral export arrangements spanning several years. Their relationship that evening was informal, shaped more by familiarity than hierarchy or negotiation. Ricardo had visited Eduardo's residence in São Paulo days earlier on Christmas Day. That visit had been uneventful, reinforcing the expectation that Eduardo's presence in Rio would be routine and socially oriented rather than operationally significant. The invitation-only gathering had been assembled with deliberate restraint. It was not structured as a conventional celebration, but as a closed-door meeting space for figures connected to Brazil's mining exports, port logistics, and infrastructure finance networks. The guest list reflected that industrial alignment. Senior executives from iron ore operations in Minas Gerais and Pará, port terminal administrators from Brazil's southeast coast, and commodity-linked financiers formed small conversational clusters across the room. Discussions moved fluidly between market positioning, shipping constraints, and the early outlook for Asian steel demand in the coming year. A private chef had been commissioned for the evening, preparing a menu built around imported luxury ingredients rarely served outside high-end restaurants. Courses were paced slowly around discussion, port throughput, contract renewals, and shipping capacity projections. Among the final dishes was Chilean sea bass accompanied by a lobster beurre blanc made from imported cold water lobster, one of the most expensive plates served that evening. As midnight passed and the new year began, the final savory course was served. Eduardo chose the sea bass with lobster beurre blanc. Several guests later recalled him complimenting the dish shortly before the reaction began. He had never been told by a doctor that he was allergic to shellfish, but people who knew him later remembered that he had felt a slight irritation in his mouth after eating seafood more than once. Each time the feeling was small, went away quickly. He never went to see a doctor about it. Several minutes later, Eduardo paused mid-sentence, cleared his throat, and took a sip of water. At first, the reaction appeared minor, easily attributed to dryness or fatigue, and no immediate attention was drawn to it in the crowded setting. Within a short interval, the change became more distinct. Swallowing became difficult, his breathing shifted subtly, and visible flushing developed across his face and neck. A security staff member trained in basic emergency response noticed the change in posture before most guests did. As lip swelling appeared and speech became strained, the staff member approached and signaled for attention. The security staff member noticed before most guests did. I find that worth acknowledging. That kind of attention matters. Within minutes, breathing difficulty became evident, and Eduardo leaned forward with one hand rising toward his throat. Emergency services were contacted immediately, but New Year's Day crowds near Copacabana Beach affected emergency access significantly. On-site security provided basic first aid while waiting for paramedics, but symptoms had already progressed beyond the initial phase. Paramedics arrived after a delayed transit through congested holiday conditions and initiated advanced airway management before transporting him to a nearby hospital. The doctors said his symptoms matched a severe allergic reaction, most likely set off by shellfish proteins found in the lobster sauce he had eaten earlier. Eduardo Vasconcelos was pronounced dead shortly after midnight. The cause of death was recorded as anaphylactic shock, secondary to shellfish exposure, with a contributing delay in medical stabilization due to extreme holiday congestion.